Hi, right now we're going to learn how to make some fermented beet pickles. If you're like me, I really love that summer taste of pickled beets. And so all we need to make fermented pickled beets are just some beets that have been rinsed in cold water, peeled, and then I have cubed mine. You could even just slice them if you'd rather have sliced pickled beets. And then the other thing we need to make our fermented pickled beets are some brine. The brine is really simple. I just looked in my old recipe books, picked out one of the brine recipes, and used the spice mix. So I put a couple cups of water into a pot on the stove, and mine called for 16 cloves, whole cloves, 8 allspice berries, and 4 about 2 to 3 inch cinnamon sticks. And you just put them all in the pot and just boil it, and then let it just turn it off and let it cool. And then you remove all the spices and the berries. And then you've got the flavored liquid. I also, since we would like our beets to be sweet, I sweetened the brine with using some erythritol mixed with stevia. You can also use xylitol. The reason we don't use sugar is because the lactic acid, the lactobacillus bacteria, actually eats the sugar and changes it to lactic acid. So the longer they ferment, the more sour they get, rather than picking up that sweet flavor of pickled beets. So to make the pickled beets, basically you just need the beets, the brine, and this liquid turns into brine and we add the salt to it. We would add unrefined sea salt with no additives, so make sure you read the label, because a lot of times it says unrefined sea salt, but then it also contains anti-caking agents, and that's one thing we don't want. So when we make the brine, our liquid into brine, basically it's just 2 cups of liquid to every half tablespoon of salt. And it's that simple. And you just stir it up, and then we have the brine. So to make the pickled beets, you just have your jar. I'm using just a pint jar. And you just want to put your beets in. And you just sort of pack them in. You want to sort of make sure they're as tightly packed as possible, and that way it gets rid of and eliminates some of the air pockets that could develop. And the reason we don't want any air pockets is because the lactofermentation, when we do that, it's actually an anaerobic process that takes place. So we need to make sure that there is no air, because anaerobic means no oxygen. So the bacteria thrive in an environment where there is no oxygen. So we want to make sure we pack the beets in nice and tight. And then, since our brine, you want to leave probably 1.5 inches or even 2 inches, especially when you're working with vegetables or fruits that have a lot of sugar in them. Because if not, you can get a very, what they call an effervescent or lively ferment, and it can actually bubble up over top of the rim of the jar, and you will have lovely beet juice flowing everywhere. So after you've got your beets packed in, you just pour in the prepared brine. And I'm going to leave that space. But I'm going to even just take the spoon here and kind of poke the handle around, just to make sure I've got rid of all the air bubbles. Looks pretty good now. So once you've got your beets packed in there, and I've got, see, they're below the level of the brine. I might add just a little bit more. The next thing we need to do is to place something on top of this that's going to keep the vegetables beneath the brine. And that's what makes it an anaerobic environment. And I've just got a biodegradable plastic lid that I bought some from one of the local stores, and I cut it to fit, and you just press it down inside on top. And now you can see that the beets are now below the brine. And it's that simple. And then that's called our primary follower. And this, you need a secondary follower just to make sure that that plastic disc remains beneath the brine. This is just a jar with some water in it, and all it does is basically make sure that the beets stay beneath the brine. And that's all that our secondary follower does. And then you would just take a nice cloth, and you just take an elastic band or a piece of twine and just tie it around the top. And what that does, that just makes sure that no bugs are going to get inside. And for the first few days of your ferment, just keep peeking just to make sure that everything is still beneath the brine. And you'll just put it maybe in a cool spot on your kitchen counter, just out of the direct sunlight, and just check it every day, and then give a taste after maybe 7 days. And if it's got a nice brine flavor, a beet pickled flavor. And if it no longer feels effervescent in your mouth, especially with the sugars in the beets, it almost gives a carbonated feel. If you have that, then you know it needs to ferment a little longer. But when you're done and it's got the right flavor, you remove that follower and just put a screw lid on top, just like you would normally with some of your and then put it in your fridge. When we store the ferments in the fridge, it doesn't stop the fermentation, but it really decreases the rate of the fermentation. So something like these pickled beets would probably last 6 months to a year in your fridge. That's it.